I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm celebrating that we have sun by filming in front of my coping cabana, otherwise known as a storage shed. And I feel like I should have something more festive to talk about, but what's on my mind is Kennedy and his ethical inconsistencies. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in terms of Israel, Roger Waters, Malone versus Breggin, and also in terms of Bitcoin. So let me start out by explaining what the difference is between a position on an issue and an ethical position. I feel like this shouldn't actually need to be explained. It should be something that kids learn in grade school, that we at least learn in college, and certainly that would be taught in law school. But here's where I think we're not really understanding this difference. When you talk about an issue, you're talking about a proper noun. You're saying, what is your position on this? And it's particular about who it's talking about and what it's talking about. We have the saying that justice is blind. So what does that mean? What that means is that you can separate out who, it doesn't matter who, that who can be switched among any different people of different categories, and the statement should still be true. So an ethical position is one in which there are no proper nouns. It's like an algebra equation where you can take anything that fits that category and you can substitute this for this. And you can flip them and say that if this is true for this, then the reverse must also be true. And that anytime you want to take that category and apply it in a different way, you can do that as long as you're clarifying. Now, when I say ethical consistency, that's really redundant because ethics is consistency. If you have something that you're calling an ethical position, but it requires the use of proper nouns, then that's not really ethics. That's favoritism. That's saying that justice is not blind, that before you can determine whether something is right or wrong, first you have to know who it applies to. That's the position that we've gotten in with all of our politics, and most of the time people are okay with saying, I'm going to vote for someone who shares my position on the issues, and they don't really look at what are the ethics behind that. In fact, I would go so far as to say the only politician that I've known who actually ran consistently on ethics was Ron Paul. And so now when we're looking at what are the politicians and how do we separate out who we're going to be in favor of, even though I agree with many of Robert Kennedy's positions on the issues, I still have questions about what his ethical consistency is. Recently, Glenn Greenwald interviewed Bobby Kennedy, and I didn't hear the interview, but I listened to his discussion on his locals group afterwards. One thing he said was that he was sure that there were many people who were disturbed by Kennedy's position in backing Israel unequivocally. And Glenn also said that he was disturbed by that, but he presented to Bobby Kennedy, well, you're saying that we don't have the money to be able to support Ukraine when we have people in need in our own country. And doesn't that same logic apply to supporting Israel? What he heard Kennedy say was, you make a really good point, and I'm going to need to think about that. So he gave Kennedy a lot of credit in terms of listening and being willing to say, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I should change my mind. Now, there's definitely a lot of shady things that are going on in order to discredit Kennedy. There are people willing to jump on to anything that they can. And one of those was his affirmation of Roger Waters, which he then ended up retracting. So flip-flopping in a way that really didn't make him friends on either side. First, he supported him, and then when he found out Roger Waters' position on Israel, he rescinded that. So Roger Waters is ethically consistent, that he is against U.S. intervention. He's against U.S. support financially for any regime that then is committing human rights offenses. One of the studies that really changed the course of my life was a simple line graph. And what it did was track how much aid the U.S. gave to different countries and the number of human rights violations that that country had committed. And what there was a direct correlation between those two things. And that forever changed my mind about what my country was doing in other countries. It is something that makes me very data oriented, that once someone can show me that there's that correlation, I know that's not just a mistake. That's not just an anecdote. That is a definite strategy. And another very curious thing was the recent article on Bobby Kennedy's grandson fights in Ukraine. And so I read a little of that article and then wrote on Sage Hannah's Substack, well, this must be Bobby Kennedy's son because it's talking about his stepmother. And everyone was confused. Well, why would it say his grandson? So there's this skipping over. Let's talk about the person who isn't actually living and ignore the fact that there actually is a living Bobby Kennedy who is running for president, whose son this is. This is something that in some ways has been useful in terms of doing research, because I end up finding research about the history of the Kennedys when I'm really trying to figure out the living Bobby Kennedy and his position on Israel. One of the articles that I found when looking for Bobby Kennedy's position on Israel was an article from Tablet by Shalom Goldman, and he writes Bobby Kennedy's admiration for Israel, but he's talking about Bobby Kennedy Sr. So here's what it says. In the 1940s, some Americans with political and cultural clout began organizing against the Zionist cause. They had a variety of reasons. Some were isolationists who did not want the United States entangled in Middle Eastern affairs. Others sympathized with the Arab view that Zionism was a new form of European colonialism. And without a doubt, some in the emerging anti-Zionist camp were anti-Semites. Among the most influential and strident opponents of such Jewish causes was Joseph P. Kennedy, patriarch and architect of the famed political dynasty. Though he was better known as a politician and a financier than as a member of the creative class, he worked during the 1920s in the Hollywood film industry, and it was there 2 decades before the 1940s that he developed and propagated his criticism of Jews and Jewish nationalism. In 1938, President Franklin Roosevelt appointed Joseph Kennedy, who had helped FDR in his 1936 election campaign, as the U.S. ambassador to Britain. In London, Kennedy allied himself with British advocates for appeasement and befriended the Nazi-appointed German ambassador, who described him as Germany's best friend in London. When war broke out in September 1939, Kennedy's call for U.S. neutrality in the European conflict put him increasingly at odds with FDR. Kennedy blamed the Jew media and the Jewish pundits in New York and Los Angeles for Roosevelt's 1940 election victory and for moving forward U.S. support of England in its struggle against the Nazis. Before he left his post in London, Kennedy made a trip to California. In Hollywood, he invited some 50 studio executives, producers, and writers, almost all of them Jews, to meet with him. During the meeting, Kennedy harangued the assembled group, warning them of the dangers anti-Nazi films posed to world peace. According to actor and producer Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who attended the meeting, Kennedy threw the fear of God into many of our producers and executives by telling them that the Jews were on the spot and that they should stop making anti-Nazi pictures. President Roosevelt's decision to ask for Kennedy's resignation stemmed in part from the account of that meeting supplied by Fairbanks, who was a close friend of the president. So let's look at some of the semantic tricks in here. You have the words Zionist and Nazi, which both convey a national movement for a particular group, and that is part of the ruling elites and is a philosophy that is not an entire people. But then you have Jews and Germans. In this case, though, anyone who is against the Zionist is definitely an anti-Semite. So even though they mention that there are isolationists who are against Middle Eastern entanglement. Now, an isolationist is someone who doesn't believe that a country should be trading with other countries, not someone who doesn't believe that you should be invading other countries. And then it puts another category of those who sympathized with the Arab view that Zionism was a new form of colonialism. Is there anyone today who can actually doubt that? So you have two good reasons that someone could have been against the U.S. entangling itself in a European conflict. And it's interesting that Shalom characterizes this as the U.S. supporting England in its struggle against the Nazis. So this correlates with Churchill saying that his intention was that Germany and Russia should bleed each other dry, and that he didn't want to intervene too soon because he wanted to make sure and exacerbate this. So for Joe Kennedy to be saying, I think we should not be making anti-German movies, essentially anti-German propaganda, is what he's talking about, because it is something that is going to endanger world peace. There's no question that that actually was true, that did end up creating a world war that the U.S. became a part of. Now let's look at the next generation and Bobby Kennedy Sr., who became at 22, after college and before law school, a reporter in the Middle East. RFK chose a side. Jews have a fine fighting force, make up for lack of arms with undying spirit, unparalleled courage, impress the world. The article gets directly to the point. The Jewish people in Palestine who believe in and have been working towards this national state have become an immensely proud and determined people. It is already a truly great modern example of the birth of a nation with the primary ingredients of dignity and self-respect. Many similar articles appeared in the American press of the day. The surprising thing about these Boston Post articles was not their pro-Zionist sentiments, but the fact that they had been written by Joseph P. Kennedy's son. So what it's admitting there is that there were many articles that were pro-Zionist. And so that's not pro-Jewish, that's pro-Zionist. But that hasn't been enough to be able to counteract Joseph Kennedy's wanting world peace and not wanting anti-German propaganda to be promoted in order to get the U.S. to support England against Germany. Instead, there was what was called the Curse of the Hasidim, and this was a group of Hasidic Jews who were worshiping and praying on a boat where Joe Kennedy was, and that Joe Kennedy forced them to go below deck. And this has been a curse that they've put on the Kennedys, and this is spoken about by the author Shalom. He says, as a 15-year-old student at an Orthodox yeshiva on New York's Lower East Side, I attended the public funeral of one of the great Torah scholars of the generation. Thousands gathered to hear the eulogies. The speech that made the deepest impression on me was by a well-known rabbi who said that the families of politicians like the Kennedys who were indifferent to the fate of the murdered Jews of Europe would be cursed for generations. Their children, to invoke biblical language, would have to suffer for the sins of their fathers. Though I forgot much of what I learned in that yeshiva, I never forgot that speech, and I was reminded of it each time I learned that a member of the Kennedy family had come to catastrophic harm. In contrast to their father and their eldest brother, John and Robert Kennedy did not seem to harbor hostility toward Jews. In fact, as they entered politics, they developed sympathetic attitudes towards Jews and Zionism. They found their father's opposition to a Jewish state, couched as it was in anti-Semitic and isolationist terms, deeply troubling, and they worked hard to change the perception that the Kennedys were anti-Semitic. As I describe in The Devil and Naomi Wolf, when people believe that God is backing their curses, they don't leave it up to God. They are the ones who take the land that God has entitled them to. They're the ones who enslave the people, like the Canaanites, that God has given them and cursed them to be their slaves. And that is what the version of the Semitic Bible that has survived says. It says that God has given the Canaanites to be slaves forever to the Shemites, to the sons of Shem. So I think we should be looking at this not as an idle biblical prediction in terms of the sons being visited on, but looking at this as motive and then looking for means, because this is not just an idle prediction. This is a threat. And then we get to Bobby Kennedy Jr. and his position on Israel as reported by Haaretz. Champion for Israel, RFK flip-flops on Roger Waters' Holocaust and anti-Semitism. It writes, Kennedy also said he saw the matter of the United States providing unconditional aid to Israel as a long and complex question. I've been to Israel, specifically on Palestinian settlements within Israel, odd sort of phrase, and however you want to call it, the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, and I've spoken with government officials there, he said, mistakenly attributing the ownership of settlements and describing the occupied territory by a biblical name favored by Jewish settlers. I understand that Palestinians are mistreated in Israel. I've seen the water allocations that were very, very unfairly allocated to the new settlements rather than to traditional settlements, in some cases for 100 years, Kennedy added. He went on to blame the lack of a two-state solution on the Palestinians, charging that the Palestinian leadership had prioritized killing Jews over reaching a diplomatic solution to the conflict. I think it's evident that the middle of the road is a dangerous place to stand. While Bobby Kennedy is certainly not appeasing those who accuse him of being anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist or having an inherited history of that from his grandfather, at the same time, he is definitely not pleasing those who are looking for ethical consistency, who are looking for people to be treated in the same way, and whatever rights that you would give to one, you would give to others. And now let's look at what Bobby Kennedy said about Robert Malone when asked by the Vermont paper, and the way that the reporter phrased his leading question was, "What do you admire most about mRNA vaccine inventor and COVID-19 vaccine critic Robert Malone?" And Bobby answered, "I think Robert Malone has tremendous integrity and tremendous courage. And here's a guy who spent his whole life at the center of the vaccine industrial complex and invented the key technology of the mRNA vaccine and was in a position where he could have made himself a billionaire during the pandemic. Instead, he took a much more difficult role that destroyed his relationships, that destroyed his credibility in his own industry, that put him in a very challenging place economically. It takes a lot of guts. If you're Bob Malone, every day of your life is really hard because people are coming at you from every angle." So let's examine that. Could Robert Malone have made himself a billionaire during the pandemic in a way that he turned down? Now, he has already famously said that he does not own the patent on the mRNA vaccine, that all he got for it was a Susan B. Anthony dollar. And so I don't believe that there's a way that he could have leveraged that without owning that technology into becoming a billionaire with it. But he also did what he could to be able to promote his famotidine as something that would then enable him to be able to make money on that as a cure. That until that ended up going kind of up in flames because they ran out of patients that they could even try it on, that was something that he was putting his eggs in that basket. And that seemed like the most lucrative thing that he could be doing at the time. He also was helping Steve Kirsch and with his application for BARDA and to get another product that was an SSRI that would have the EU authorization. So that's another way that they were both looking at profiting off of the pandemic, because those were things that were not like hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, where they were already generics. These were things that could be reserved and where the price could go up substantially if they had that EU authorization. Now let's look at, if you're Bob Malone, every day of your life is really, really hard because people are coming at you from all angles. Personally, I think that waking up in the morning with 25 million hanging over your head and needing to make sure that you have lawyers who are going to protect you sounds a heck of a lot harder than people are criticizing me. I may have to use my million Twitter followers and my $1 million Substack in order to refute some of these things that they're saying. I don't know whether Bobby Kennedy has actually read what it was that Robert Malone filed against the Breggins. It was reading that, for me, as not a lawyer, that made me say, wait a minute, where's the defamation? I was expecting to read it, and I was expecting that I was going to find things that made me back Robert Malone. But instead, everything that I read in that filing was something that made me say, no, he's not really talking about defamation here. What the Breggins are saying is something that is legitimate, and he's mischaracterizing it, and he's using defamation in his filing. So, as a lawyer, I have to believe that if Bobby Kennedy has read that filing, he would come to the same conclusion. And if he hasn't read that, he should certainly, before he makes public statements like this, read the motion to dismiss that the lawyer for the Breggins has written. And I will link it because it is one of the most beautifully written, professional, well thought out, logical, backed up with rational ties to all the case history that I have ever read. So that's something that I think Robert Kennedy needs to be logically consistent about. And my final word on Bitcoin is not really an ethical position so much as it is strategic. Bobby Kennedy has given a talk at a Bitcoin conference, and he has come out with some very strong statements in favor of Bitcoin. I don't really understand the technology, but my position is that money is a means of organizing labor in the interest of whoever creates it, and that what we've been given, the houses, the infrastructure, the land, the knowledge, that these are things that belong to all of us, and that by using them to back a money system that is community-oriented, that then we can make sure that we're using that to pass on the gift to the next generation, that it shouldn't be something where those who happen to have the ability to buy into a system now are the ones who end up owning all of these things that should be backing a system for all of us. To follow up on this, I'm going to recommend the ethical positions in what am I looking for in a president, and then also Kennedy and Malone. Thank you for watching.